The Grand Council Chamber of the Thravian Empire had been designed over 3 centuries ago by architects who understood power. Not just the wielding of it, but the feeling of it. The vaulted ceiling stretched 40 feet overhead, carved from the living rock of the mountain itself. Bioluminescent crystals embedded in the stone hixed shifting patterns of blue and violet light across the assembled nobles, military commanders, and diplomatic representatives gathered below. Princess Lyra Thrabis sat very still in the smaller chair beside her mother's throne, her hands folded in her lap the way her tutors had taught her. 7 years old by human developmental standards, she had learned early that being a princess meant sitting quietly while adults discussed things she barely understood. Trade agreements with the human settlements above ground, military positioning along the territorial boundaries, reports from the engineering corps about the expansion of the northern caverns. She tried to pay attention. She really did. But the words blurred together into a monotonous hum that made her want to fidget, to ask questions, to do anything except sit perfectly still, with her scales arranged in the neutral pattern that meant nothing at all. Her mother, Queen Seraphina, sat beside her with the kind of absolute composure that came from decades of practice. The queen's scales shifted through subtle patterns of silver and deep purple, each configuration conveying layers of meaning to those who knew how to read them. Authority, consideration, measured neutrality. Everything about her mother was deliberate, calculated, precise. Lyra had been trying to master those same patterns for months now. Her tutors said she was improving. But sitting here in the council chamber, watching her mother rule with such effortless control, Lyra felt small and insignificant and utterly inadequate. A human security consultant stood at the center of the chamber floor presenting findings to the assembled court. Marcus Blackwell, according to the formal introduction that had preceded his report. He had worked for the palace for 6 months conducting a comprehensive assessment of defensive systems and protocols. Lyra had seen him a few times in passing, always from a distance, always surrounded by guards or technical staff. He looked uncomfortable now, standing in the spotlight of the court's attention. Humans always look small in Thravian spaces. Their average height barely reached 6 feet, dwarfed by the 7 to 8 foot frames of her people. This one was tallish for a human, broad-shouldered, in his formal dark suit, but still somehow diminished by the scale of the chamber around him. Lyra let her attention drift away from his words. Something about perimeter sensors and redundancy protocols and integration with the monitoring systems. Technical details that meant nothing to her. Instead, she found herself studying the human's face. He had dark hair cut very short, clean-shaven with lines around his eyes that suggested he squinted at things often. His posture was straight but not rigid, and his hands moved occasionally as he spoke, small gestures that emphasized his points without calling excessive attention to themselves. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of Lyra's memory. She tilted her head slightly, trying to place it. Had she seen him before, more than just in passing? The tutors said human faces all look similar until you learn to distinguish the subtle variations. But this one felt different, known. The human finished his presentation and answered a few questions from the military commanders. Technical queries about response times and coverage gaps. He answered each one directly without embellishment, his voice carrying through the chamber's acoustics with surprising clarity. And then Lyra heard it, really heard it, the cadence of his voice, the particular rhythm of his speech patterns, the way he paused fractionally between thoughts, choosing his words with precision. Her heart stopped. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. Kai had been imaginary. That's what everyone had told her. The tutors, the guards, even her mother had said so with gentle patience. The friend she remembered from that terrifying night 6 months ago, the one who had found her crying and lost and alone, the one who had told her stories about Earth and walked her safely home, he hadn't been real. Her mind had created him to cope with the trauma of being separated from her attendants. But that voice, she knew that voice. Lyra leaned forward in her chair, her neutral scale pattern flickering with sudden intensity. The human was turning to leave. His report concluded, beginning the formal exit from the chamber that protocol demanded. She couldn't let him walk away. Not without knowing, not without finding out if the impossible was somehow true. Her tutors had drilled proper behavior into her since she was old enough to understand language. A princess did not interrupt court proceedings. A princess did not draw attention to herself unnecessarily. A princess certainly did not leave her seat during formal assembly. Lyra stood up anyway. The chamber was enormous. 200 nobles, commanders, and officials filled the space, arranged in hierarchies of rank and importance. The human security consultant was already 40 feet away, walking toward the exit with measured steps. She started moving, not running, not yet, just walking quickly, her small feet carrying her down from the raised platform where the throne sat across the polished stone floor toward the retreating figure. Her mother's voice cut through the chamber behind her, sharp with surprise. Lyra! She didn't stop. She couldn't stop, because the human had turned at the sound of her name, and she could see his face clearly now, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was right. The walking became running. Protocol shattered like glass. A princess did not run in the Grand Council chamber. Running was undignified, chaotic beneath the station of royalty. But Lyra's legs pumped harder, her ceremonial robes tangling briefly around her ankles before she kicked free of them, her attention locked on the human who had stopped completely now, staring at her with an expression of dawning recognition and something that looked like horror. The assembled court went absolutely silent. It was the kind of silence that happens when hundreds of people collectively hold their breath. When witnesses to the impossible freeze in place, uncertain whether what they're seeing is actually happening. The kind of silence that feels heavy physical pressing down on everyone in the space with the weight of profound disruption. Lyra reached him and threw her arms around his waist, squeezing as tightly as her 7-year-old strength allowed. He was solid and real, and exactly the right height for her to bury her face against his jacket and feel for the first time in 6 months the bone-deep certainty that she hadn't been wrong. Kai, she said, her voice carrying in the profound quiet. You came back. I knew you were real. I knew it. The human Marcus Blackwell, the same person, stood completely frozen. His hands had lifted slightly, hovering uncertainly like he wasn't sure whether he was allowed to return the embrace. Lyra could feel his heartbeat through his suit jacket, fast and hard, with what she recognized as panic. She lifted her face to look up at him. His expression was exactly as she remembered from that night. Kind eyes, focused attention, the look of someone who actually saw her instead of seeing through her to whatever political calculation she represented. It's me, she said, quieter now, but still audible in the silent chamber. Remember, you found me by the fountain. You told me about the eagles and the mountains and the ocean that breathes. You walked with me until I wasn't scared anymore. Something shifted in his face, recognition becoming certainty. He looked down at her with an expression that mixed wonder and dismay in equal measure, and his voice when he spoke was gentle despite the tension in his frame. You're the girl from the gardens. Not a question, a statement of fact delivered with the kind of precision she remembered. This was Kai. This was the person who had saved her when she'd been more terrified than she'd ever been in her life. Lyra nodded, her scales brightening with patterns of joy and vindication. I told Mother about you. I told everyone. But they said you were imaginary, that I'd made you up because I was scared. She turned her head without releasing him, looking back across the vast chamber toward the throne platform. Her mother had risen, standing at the edge of the raised area with her hands gripped together in front of her. Queen Seraphina's scale patterns were flickering rapidly through configurations Lyra had never seen before. Shock, confusion, something that might have been fear. Mother, Lyra called out, her voice ringing clear in the continued silence. This is Kai, the one I told you about. He saved me. He's not imaginary. He's real. The queen began descending from the platform, her movements controlled but swift. Guards shifted position throughout the chamber, uncertain whether this constituted a security threat or merely unprecedented social breach. Nobles whispered to each other behind raised hands, their own scale patterns flickering with curiosity and scandalized interest. Marcus Kai finally moved his hands, placing them gently on Lyra's shoulders, not pushing her away, but creating just enough space that he could meet her eyes directly. I think, he said with deliberate calm, we've caused quite a disruption. I don't care. Lyra's response was immediate and fierce. They said you weren't real. They said I imagined you. But I knew. I knew you were real, and I looked for you every day, and I never found you, but I knew. Her mother reached them, and the scattered guards closed in around them in a loose perimeter. Queen Seraphina's violet eyes moved between her daughter and the human, taking in their proximity, the easy familiarity in Lyra's posture, the gentle restraint of the human's hands on her daughter's shoulders. Lyra. The Queen's voice carried absolute authority, but there was something underneath it that Lyra didn't have the sophistication to identify. Later, she would recognize it as barely controlled emotion. Release him and return to my side. But mother, now! The tone left no room for argument. Lyra reluctantly loosened her grip and stepped back half a pace. Though she kept herself positioned between her mother and Kai, some instinct telling her that he might need protection, even if she didn't understand from what. Marcus immediately executed a deep formal bow, his eyes dropping to the floor in the gesture of submission that humans used when addressing Thravian royalty. Your Majesty, I apologize for any disruption. I didn't intend, you saved my daughter. The Queen cut him off, her words clipped and precise. When how explain? The entire court was watching now, all pretense of discretion abandoned. This was unprecedented. A princess publicly embracing a human contractor. Claims of some past rescue that had never been reported. The Queen herself descending from the throne to confront a security consultant in the middle of the chamber floor. Marcus straightened from his bow, but kept his eyes respectfully lowered. 6 months ago, Your Majesty, late evening, I was conducting perimeter security assessments in the Eastern Gardens. When I heard someone crying, I found... He hesitated, glancing briefly at Lyra. I found a child by the fountain. She was lost and frightened. I helped her find her way back to the palace guards. You didn't report this. Not a question, an accusation. I filed a report recommending improved sensor coverage in that section of the gardens, Your Majesty. The specific incident of finding one lost child seemed less relevant than addressing the security gap that had allowed it to happen. The Queen's scales flickered with something sharp and dangerous. You found my daughter alone and lost, and you thought this warranted merely a technical notation? I didn't know she was your daughter. Marcus's response was quiet but firm. She was just a scared child who needed help finding her way home. That's all. Lyra watched her mother's face, trying to read the emotions flickering across it. The Queen looked at her daughter, then back at the human, then at the assembled court, watching this drama unfold with rapt attention. This assembly is adjourned. Queen Seraphina announced, her voice ringing with a finality. We will reconvene tomorrow morning. Marcus Blackwell, you will attend me in private audience immediately. She looked down at Lyra, her expression softening fractionally. Come, daughter, we have much to discuss. The Queen turned and swept back toward the throne platform, her robes trailing behind her in formal dignity. Guards moved to flank her, and the assembled nobles began filing toward the exits, their whispered conversations building to a low roar of speculation and surprise. Lyra looked up at Marcus one more time. He met her eyes briefly, and something in his expression made her think of that night 6 months ago. The way he'd crouched down to her level. The way he'd offered his hand without hesitation when she'd reached for it. The way he'd talked about Earth with such easy familiarity, making her feel less alone in her terror. Don't leave, she said quietly, urgently. Please don't leave. I'm not going anywhere, he replied, and the promise in his voice made her believe him. Lyra turned and ran back to her mother, her mind already racing ahead to what would happen next. The private audience, the explanations, the revelation that the friend she'd clung to for 6 months hadn't been imaginary after all. She'd been right. She'd been right all along. And somehow that felt like the most important thing in the world. The private audience chamber was smaller than the Grand Council space, but somehow more intimidating. Fewer witnesses meant less protection. Lyra sat beside her mother on a cushioned bench while Marcus stood at respectful distance, his posture military straight, but his hands relaxed at his sides. Catherine Walsh, her mother's senior advisor, stood near the door with a tablet ready to document whatever revelations emerged. 2 guards flanked the entrance, their presence a reminder that, despite the intimate setting, this was still an official proceeding. Tell me everything, Queen Seraphina commanded, her attention focused entirely on Marcus. The complete story of that evening. Nothing omitted. Marcus took a breath, and Lyra watched his face as he gathered his thoughts. He looked different now than he had in the gardens that night. More professional, more guarded. But his voice when he spoke had the same measured quality she remembered. 6 months ago, late spring, I was working on the security and assessment, specifically testing the perimeter sensor network in the less trafficked sections of the palace grounds. It was approximately 2200 hours when I heard someone crying. I followed the sound and found a child sitting by the fountain in the eastern gardens. He glanced at Lyra, and she nodded encouragingly. She was alone, clearly distressed, lost. I approached, slowly identified myself as someone who worked for the palace, and asked if she was hurt. She wasn't just frightened and unable to find her way back to wherever she was supposed to be. Queen Seraphina's scales flickered with tightly controlled emotion. And what did you do? I sat down at her level so I wouldn't be intimidating. Asked her name. She said. He paused, looking at Lyra again. I said, Lyra, the princess supplied helpfully, and you said your friends called you Kai. I offered to help her find her way back. She was scared, so I talked to keep her calm. Told her about Earth, about the places I'd been. She asked questions and I answered them. We walked until I could see palace guards, and I made sure she reached them safely before returning to my work. The queen's voice was dangerously quiet. You returned to your work, as if nothing significant had happened. I filed a report about the security gap that had allowed a child to wander unsupervised into that area. Recommended additional sensors and regular patrol coverage. The individual incident seemed less important than preventing it from happening again. The individual incident, Seraphina repeated slowly, involved my daughter being missing for 3 hours, being lost and alone and terrified. You didn't think that warranted special mention? Marcus met her eyes steadily. I thought ensuring no other child could be lost in the same way was more valuable than taking credit for helping one scared kid. Your Majesty. Silence fell in the chamber. Lyra looked between the adults, trying to understand the tension crackling in the air. Her mother's scales were shifting through patterns of anger and something else, something complicated that Lyra couldn't interpret. Lyra, the queen said without taking her eyes off Marcus. Tell me what you remember of that night. Lyra sat up straighter, relieved to finally be included in the conversation. I was exploring the gardens with my attendants. We were playing a game and I went around a corner and couldn't find them anymore. I called for them, but no one answered. I kept walking and got more lost, and it was getting dark and I was scared. The memory was still vivid, the growing panic, the realization that she didn't know where she was, the terrible certainty that she'd done something wrong and was going to be in trouble. I sat by the fountain and cried. I didn't know what else to do. And then Kai came. She looked at Marcus with pure gratitude. He wasn't scary at all, he was kind. He said his name was Kai and that he could help me find my way home. What else did he say? Her mother pressed. Lyra closed her eyes, pulling up the memories she'd replayed hundreds of times over the past 6 months. He told me about Earth, about mountains called the Blue Ridge Range where eagles fly, about a river named Shenandoah that winds through valleys, about an ocean so big you can't see the other side and how the waves sound like the planet breathing. She opened her eyes and looked at Marcus. He told me about constellations, Orion and Cassiopeia and Ursa Major. He said even though they looked different from Earth than from here, they were the same stars. That no matter where you are, you're always looking at the same sky. Marcus's expression had softened as she spoke, some of his professional reserve giving way to genuine warmth. You remembered all of that. I remember everything. Lyra's voice was fierce with conviction. I remember how you held my hand while we walked, how you kept talking so I wouldn't be scared, how you made sure I could see the guards before you left, how you said even though I wouldn't see you, you'd still be around the palace keeping people safe. She turned to her mother. I looked for him every day. Every time we went to the gardens, I searched. I thought maybe I'd see him and I could show him the flowers and tell him I remembered the constellation stories. But he was never there. Queen Seraphina's attention shifted to her daughter, and something in her expression cracked. You told me about Kai. For months you talked about your friend who found you and told you Earth stories. And you said he was imaginary. Lyra didn't mean for the accusation to sound as sharp as it did, but the hurt was still fresh. Everyone said I'd made him up, that my mind invented a friend because I was traumatized. The tutors were worried. The doctors asked me questions. Everyone thought I was broken because I kept talking about someone who wasn't real. The queen's scales shifted to patterns of deep distress. I thought we all thought, you thought I was making him up. Lyra finished the sentence, her voice smaller now. You didn't believe me. Oh, my daughter. Serafina reached out and pulled Lyra against her side, holding her tightly. I'm so sorry. I should have investigated more thoroughly. I should have listened more closely to what you were telling me. You were speaking truth and I dismissed it. Lyra buried her face against her mother's shoulder, feeling tears prick at her eyes. She'd spent 6 months being treated like she was fragile, damaged, unable to distinguish reality from fantasy. And all along she'd been right. Marcus cleared his throat quietly. Your Majesty, I genuinely had no idea Princess Lyra had been searching for me, or that my help that night had affected her so profoundly. If I'd known I would have... He stopped, seeming unsure how to finish the sentence. Would have what? Serafina asked, still holding her daughter. Come forward, revealed yourself, explained the situation. Yes. Why didn't you? The question wasn't accusatory now, just sincerely curious. Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with precision. Because I'm a contract security consultant, and she's a princess. Those aren't worlds that intersect. I helped a lost child file my report and assumed that was the end of it. I didn't think my identity mattered. I didn't think she'd remember me. I remembered everything, Lyra said again, pulling away from her mother to look at him. You were the only person who treated me like I was just a regular kid, not a princess, not someone important, just a scared little girl who needed help. Something passed across Marcus's face, understanding maybe, or recognition of a truth he hadn't fully considered before. You were just a scared little girl who needed help, he agreed quietly. That's all I saw. That's all that mattered. Catherine Walsh spoke up from her position by the door, her voice deliberately neutral. Your Majesty, we should discuss the cultural implications of this situation. Serafina nodded slowly, her attention shifting to her advisor. Explain. In Thravian culture, bonds formed during moments of genuine crisis carry significant weight. When someone provides help without expectation of reward or recognition, when they act purely from compassion rather than calculation, it creates a connection that our society considers sacred. The Queen's scales flickered with understanding. A guardian bond. Essentially, yes. Princess Lyra's public acknowledgement of Marcus Blackwell before the entire court, her physical embrace, her clear statement that he saved her, all of that establishes a recognized relationship that supersedes normal social boundaries. Marcus looked between them, clearly lost. I'm sorry, I don't understand what that means. Serafina met his eyes with an expression that mixed resignation and something that might have been respect. It means, Marcus Blackwell, that my daughter has claimed you as family, in front of 200 witnesses. According to our cultural traditions, that claim carries weight that even I cannot easily dismiss. Family, up Marcus's voice was faint with disbelief, in the sense of chosen kinship, a bond forged through care in a moment of need. Serafina looked down at Lyra, who was watching the conversation with rapt attention. My daughter trusted you completely that night. You proved worthy of that trust, and now she has publicly declared that connection. The court recognizes it. I am obligated to recognize it. Marcus stood very still, processing this information. Lyra could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, working through the implications. What does that mean practically? He asked finally. It means, the Queen said slowly, that you cannot simply return to being an anonymous contractor and fade into the background of palace operations. My daughter has elevated your status through her acknowledgement. The court will expect you to maintain some level of presence in her life, to honor the bond she's declared. Lyra felt hope flare bright in her chest. Does that mean Kai can visit me? Can he teach me more about Earth? Can we? It means, her mother interrupted gently, that we need to discuss what happens next. All of us, together. Marcus looked at Lyra and she looked back at him with all the desperate hope of a 7-year-old who'd just gotten confirmation that the most important friend she'd ever had was real and might actually be allowed to stay in her life. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to her eye level, the way he had that night by the fountain. Princess Lyra, he said formally, and she made a face at the title. He smiled slightly. I'm glad I found you that night. I'm glad you're okay. And I'm sorry I didn't realize you were looking for me. Will you stay? The question burst out of her before she could stop it. Will you be my friend still, please? Marcus glanced up at the Queen, who watched them with an expression of complex emotion. Then he looked back at Lyra and nodded once. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, I'll stay. And in that moment, surrounded by the weight of cultural traditions she barely understood and adult complications she couldn't navigate, Lyra felt something settle in her chest, something that had been unsettled and anxious for 6 long months. Kai was real. She hadn't been wrong. And he was staying. Everything else they could figure out together. 3 weeks had passed since the silence fell over the Grand Council chamber. 3 weeks since Lyra had run across polished stone to embrace a man the court had never heard of. 3 weeks since her imaginary friend had become startlingly, undeniably real. The palace gardens looked different in early winter than they had that night 6 months ago. The flowering vines that had draped the fountain were dormant now, their branches bare against the gray stone. But the fountain itself still burbled quietly water, flowing in gentle cascades that caught the filtered light from the cavern ceiling far above. Lyra sat on the fountain's edge, her legs swinging as she watched Marcus examine the sensor equipment mounted in a nearby tree. He'd been teaching her about the security systems, how they worked, what they monitored, why they were positioned where they were. It wasn't the kind of lesson her tutors provided. He didn't lecture or test her comprehension. He just explained things when she had asked, treating her questions as if they mattered. The infrared sensors detect heat signatures, he was saying, his hands gesturing to illustrate his point. Any warm-blooded creature passing through this section would trigger an alert. But 6 months ago, there was a dead zone right about where we're sitting. No coverage. Easy to walk right through without anyone knowing. Is that fixed now? Lyra asked. Fixed 3 months ago based on my recommendations. Your mother's security chief finally got the budget approval. Marcus climbed down from the lower branches, with easy grace dropping the last few feet to land beside her. You're safe here now. No more getting lost. Lyra drew patterns in the condensation on the fountain's stone rim. I wasn't really lost that night, not geographically. I was maybe 50 yards from where my attendants were searching. I was just turned around and scared, and everyone was calling my name, but I couldn't figure out which direction the voices came from. Fear makes everything harder, Marcus agreed. He sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough that she felt his presence like warmth. Makes the world seem bigger and more confusing than it is. Makes you feel smaller. I felt very small that night. The admission came quietly. I thought I'd done something wrong, that I'd gotten lost on purpose somehow, that everyone would be angry with me. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the fountain's flowing water. You were 7 years old and scared. That's not wrong. That's just being a kid. But I'm not just a kid, I'm a princess. Lyra kicked her feet against the stone, frustrated by truths she was only beginning to understand. Princesses aren't supposed to get lost. They're not supposed to be scared. They're supposed to be composed and controlled and perfect all the time. That sounds exhausting. The simple observation made Lyra laugh despite herself. It is exhausting. That's what I tried to tell Mother last week when I asked if I could attend the children's educational program in the Southern District. She said it wouldn't be appropriate, that princesses receive private instruction from certified tutors. What did you say? I asked why. Why isn't it appropriate? Why can't I learn with other children? What makes private instruction better? Lyra looked up at him, searching his face for judgment and finding only attention. She didn't have a good answer. She just said, because that's how it's always been done. Marcus smiled slightly. That's usually what people say when they don't have a good reason, but don't want to admit it. That's what I thought. Lyra's scales brightened with vindication. But I couldn't say that. You can think those things, but you can't say them. Not to the queen, not even if she's your mother. Can't you? The question hung in the cold air between them. Lyra turned it over in her, finding examining it from different angles. Could she question her mother more directly? Could she push back against because that's how it's always been done? What would happen if she did? I don't know, she said finally. No one else does. The nobles all agree with whatever Mother says. The advisors make suggestions, but they're always so polite, always diplomatic. Everyone's so worried about saying the wrong thing that they never say anything real. Except you, Marcus observed. You say real things all the time. And everyone thinks I'm difficult because of it. But Lyra said it without heat, just stating a fact she'd overheard whispered by tutors in attendance who thought she wasn't listening. They think I ask too many questions, that I should be more accepting of how things are. Marcus turned to face her fully, his expression serious in a way that made her pay attention. Lyra, never stop asking questions. Never stop wondering why things are the way they are. The people who tell you to just accept things, they're usually the ones who benefit from you not asking. The words settled into her chest like stones dropping into deep water. She didn't fully understand what he meant, not yet, but she felt the weight of it, the importance. This was the kind of thing she'd remember years from now, turning it over in her mind as she grew old enough to comprehend its full significance. Did someone tell you to stop asking questions when you were young? She asked. Marcus's smile was rueful. Many people. I didn't listen to them either. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, listening to the fountain's gentle music. Then Lyra spoke again, her voice thoughtful. Mother seems different lately. Have you noticed? Different how? She smiles more. Not the formal smile she uses at court functions. Real smiles. And she's been asking me questions. Not testing me on lessons. Just asking what I think about things. Lyra swung her legs, considering. Yesterday she asked me what I wanted to do when I'm older. Not what duties I'd have as queen. What I wanted to do. What did you tell her? I said I wanted to understand why things work the way they do. Why people make the choices they make. Why some traditions help and others just make things harder. Lyra looked at Marcus. She didn't tell me that wasn't appropriate for a princess. She just said those were good questions to explore. Marcus's expression was warm with approval. Your mother is learning too, just like you are. Learning what? That asking questions is how we grow. That accepting because that's how it's always been done keeps us stuck. He paused, choosing his words with precision. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you don't have all the answers. From her private office overlooking the Eastern Gardens, Queen Seraphina watched her daughter and the human through the reinforced crystal glass. They sat by the fountain talking with the easy comfort of old friends. Lyra's scales shifted through patterns of engagement and curiosity, brighter than Seraphina had seen them in months. Years, maybe. Catherine Walsh stood beside her, reviewing diplomatic correspondence on her tablet, but glancing periodically at the scene below. She's different with him, Seraphina said quietly. She's 7, Catherine replied without looking up. She's different every week. No, not like this. The Queen's hands gripped the window frame, her claws leaving faint marks in the metal. Watch her. Watch how she moves, how she speaks. She's animated, present. When was the last time you saw her look that engaged during her lessons? Catherine set down her tablet and moved to stand beside Seraphina, following her gaze to the garden below. The human was gesturing to something in the trees now, and Lyra was leaning forward asking questions that made him smile. She trusts him, Catherine observed, completely, without reservation. Seraphina's scales flickered with complex emotion. Do you know how many security reviews I ordered after that night? How many investigations I had 3 different teams examine every second of surveillance footage? I interviewed every guard who'd been on duty. I restructured the entire attendant protocol. I remember. You were thorough. I was terrified. The admission came raw and honest. My daughter had been missing for 3 hours. Alone, vulnerable. And when she started talking about this friend who'd helped her, this Kai, who'd told her stories and walked her home, I thought, her voice caught. I thought she'd broken, that the trauma had fractured something fundamental in her mind, that she'd retreated into fantasy because reality had become too frightening. Catherine's expression softened with understanding. You consulted the best child psychologists in the empire, who all assured me that imaginary friends were a normal coping mechanism, that with time and proper support, she'd integrate the experience and move past the need for the fantasy. Seraphina's laugh was bitter. And all along he was real, walking the palace corridors, filing technical reports, completely unaware that the child he'd helped was searching for him every single day. Below, Marcus was teaching Lyra something about the sensor arrays, his hands tracing invisible lines through the air to illustrate his point. Lyra watched with rapt attention, then reached out to touch the tree trunk he'd been describing, testing her understanding against physical reality. She's learning, Seraphina murmured, really learning. Not memorizing protocols or reciting lessons, actually engaging with new information because it interests her. The human has a gift for teaching, Catherine agreed. He makes complex concepts accessible, and he treats her like an intelligent person rather than a child who needs to be managed. That's what she needs. The realization settled over Serafina like a weight. That's what I haven't been giving her. I've been so focused on preparing her to be queen someday, on instilling proper protocols and appropriate behavior, that I forgot she needs to be a child first. Catherine was quiet for a long moment before speaking. You've been an exceptional ruler, Serafina. You've navigated impossible political situations. You've maintained peace across 6 territories. You've strengthened every alliance and resolved conflicts that would have destroyed lesser leaders. But I've been a terrible mother. No, Catherine's voice was firm. You've been a grieving widow trying to rule an empire alone while raising a daughter who reminds you of everything you've lost. You've been doing the best you could with an impossible situation. Serafina's scales flickered with pain. 3 years since her husband's death. 3 years of ruling alone, of being both queen and parent, of trying to give Lyra everything she needed while managing the endless demands of empire. 3 years of feeling like she was failing at both roles. He makes it look easy, she said, watching Marcus below. Being present, being attentive, just being there without second-guessing every interaction. How does he do that? Perhaps because he has nothing to gain from it, Catherine observed gently. He's not positioning himself for power. He's not building political capital. He's just helping a lonely child, because she needs help. The words struck deeper than Serafina expected, because they were true. Every interaction in her life carried weight calculation consequence. Every conversation was a negotiation. Every relationship served multiple purposes. Even her love for Lyra was complicated by duty, by legacy, by the knowledge that her daughter would someday inherit the crushing responsibility of ruling. But Marcus Blackwell had no such complications. He'd found a scared child and helped her. He'd told her stories because she was frightened. He'd walked her home because she needed someone to walk beside her. And when she'd found him again 6 months later, he'd agreed to stay in her life for no reason beyond the simple fact that she'd asked. No agenda, no calculation, just uncomplicated care. When had Serafina last experienced anything so simple? That evening, Serafina did something unprecedented. She invited Marcus to dine with her and Lyra in the private family quarters. Not a formal dinner in the state dining hall, not a working meal with advisors present, just the 3 of them in the smaller dining room where she'd once shared meals with her husband. The space felt too empty with just 3 people, but also more intimate than the grand formal settings. Marcus still looked uncomfortable in dining attire, but less rigidly so than he had at previous court functions. Lyra had insisted he sit directly across from her, ignoring the tutor's protests about proper placement protocol. Tell Mother about the ocean, Lyra said between courses, her attention fixed on Marcus with single-minded intensity. The one you told me about that night. That breathes. Marcus glanced at Serafina, who nodded permission. He set down his fork and folded his hands on the table, gathering his thoughts. The Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Virginia Beach, where I grew up. His voice was quiet but carried in the intimate space. The waves come in sets, rolling onto shore in rhythmic patterns. When you stand at the water's edge, you can feel the pull and push of it. The way the water retreats, gathering itself, then surges forward again. It sounds like breathing. Feels like the planet's heartbeat. Lyra's scales shifted to patterns of wonder. And you used to go there when you were my age. Every summer, my family had a small house 2 blocks from the beach. I'd walk down at dawn before the tourists arrived when it was just me and the gulls in the endless water. Were you lonely? The question came from Serafina, surprising herself as much as Marcus. He considered this with his characteristic precision. Sometimes, my father was military, so we moved frequently. Making friends was hard when you knew you'd be leaving again in a year or 2. The ocean was constant. Always there, always the same rhythm, even when everything else changed. So you'd sit by the ocean instead of making friends who'd eventually leave, Serafina said softly. Marcus met her eyes across the table. Or instead of being left, yes. Understanding passed between them. The loneliness of transience, the exhaustion of building relationships you knew were temporary, the temptation to retreat into solitude rather than risk connection. I understand that impulse, Serafina admitted. When my husband died, I considered pulling back from everything beyond essential duties, making myself unavailable, ruling from distance rather than presence. What stopped you? Marcus asked. Serafina looked at her daughter who was listening with focused attention. Lyra, I couldn't retreat completely while raising a child who needed more than a distant figurehead for a mother. But you did retreat, Lyra said quietly, her voice without accusation. Just observation. Not all the way, but some. You stopped taking me to court functions, stopped walking the gardens with me, stopped telling me stories before sleep. The words landed like physical blows. Serafina felt her scales flicker with distress, unable to maintain composure against the simple truth her daughter spoke. I thought I was protecting you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, shielding you from the weight of grief, from the responsibilities that were crushing me. You were protecting yourself, Lyra replied, still without accusation. Just a child's honest observation. And I was alone. The silence that fell over the table was heavy with recognition. Catherine had left them to this private meal, so it was just the three of them bearing witness to this moment. Marcus sat very still, present, but not interfering. Serafina felt something crack inside her chest. Some wall she'd built 3 years ago, brick by deliberate brick, each one laid to protect herself from the overwhelming pain of loss. Her husband dead, her daughter grieving, the empire demanding she be strong, be decisive, be anything except broken. So she'd stepped back, created distance, managed her emotions by managing her exposure to the things that hurt most, including, she realized now with devastating clarity, her own daughter. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate. Lyra, I'm so sorry. I thought I was being strong for you. I didn't realize I was abandoning you. Lyra's expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like relief. You weren't abandoning me. You were just far away, even when you were in the same room. That's why Kai mattered so much, Serafina said, understanding crystallizing. When you were lost that night, I wasn't there. But he was, and he didn't retreat or distance himself. He just showed up, stayed present, gave you the certainty that you weren't alone. She looked at Marcus, who was watching this exchange with respectful attention, trying not to intrude on intimate family revelations. You gave my daughter something I couldn't, Serafina said directly. Not because I didn't love her, but because I was too broken to show up fully. You provided what I'd failed to provide, the absolute certainty that someone cared about her without second thoughts or hesitation. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. Your Majesty, you were doing the best you could with an impossible situation. Grief doesn't follow convenient timelines. Recovery isn't linear. You didn't fail your daughter. You just needed help. Everyone needs help sometimes. I don't ask for help, Serafina said. Queens don't admit weakness. Leaders don't acknowledge vulnerability. Maybe they should. The suggestion was mild but pointed. Lyra looked between her mother and Marcus, something shifting in her expression. Understanding, perhaps, of adult complexities she'd never considered before. The realization that her mother wasn't just a queen, but a person. Someone who hurt and struggled and made mistakes while trying desperately to do the right thing. Mother, she said slowly, when you thought Kai was imaginary and you were worried about me, did you tell anyone how scared you were? Serafina's scales flickered with discomfort. I consulted specialists, psychologists who, but did you tell anyone you were scared, that you didn't know what to do, that you needed someone to help you figure it out? The question hung in the air unanswered because the answer was obvious. No. Serafina had managed the situation alone, consulting experts, but never admitting her own terror and uncertainty, never showing weakness, never asking for the kind of help that required vulnerability. I couldn't, she said finally. After your father's death, I had to prove I could rule alone. Any sign of weakness, any indication that I was struggling, would have been used against me by those who wanted to see me fail. Who would have done that? Lyra asked, genuinely confused. Political rivals, nobles who disagreed with my policies, anyone looking for an opportunity to undermine my authority. Serafina's voice was tired. That's how politics works, my daughter. Everyone is looking for advantage. Every vulnerability is a potential weapon. You learn to show nothing, Reveal nothing that could be used against you. Marcus cleared his throat quietly. Permission to speak candidly, Your Majesty. Granted. That sounds like an incredibly lonely way to live. The simple observation landed with devastating accuracy. Serafina felt tears prick at her eyes, an embarrassing display of emotion she couldn't quite control. It is, she admitted, every day, every interaction, always calculating, always defensive, never able to just exist without measuring every word and gesture. She looked at her daughter, who was watching her with wide ease. That's what I saw when you ran to him in the council chamber. You weren't calculating, you weren't defensive, you were just joyful, happy to see someone you cared about. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt that. Pure, uncomplicated happiness at seeing another person. Lyra slid off her chair and came around the table to her mother's side. She climbed into Serafina's lap the way she hadn't in years, curling against her mother's chest like she was small again. I'm happy to see you, she said quietly. Every day, even when you're busy, even when you're far away. I'm still happy you're there. Serafina wrapped her arms around her daughter and let the tears fall, not caring that Marcus could see that queens weren't supposed to cry at private dinners. For once, she didn't care about protocol or appearance or maintaining the facade of control. She just held her daughter and wept for all the distance she'd created and all the presence she'd failed to provide, all the moments she'd missed while trying desperately to be strong enough to rule alone. I love you, she whispered into Lyra's hair. I'm sorry I made you feel alone. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I've been so far away. I love you too, Lyra replied. And Kai taught me something. He said being lost doesn't last forever if someone helps you find your way. Maybe you've been lost too. Maybe we can find our way back together. Across the table, Marcus looked away, giving them privacy in their grief and reconciliation. But Serafina saw the tightness around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. Recognition of his own loneliness reflected in theirs. Marcus, she said, her voice still thick with tears but steady, why did you really leave the military? He stiffened, clearly not expecting the question. After a long moment, he answered, I questioned orders I thought were wrong. Turned out I was right. But questioning superior officers, even when you're correct, isn't exactly career-enhancing in the military. What were the orders? Classified. But the summary is I was told to take action that would have resulted in civilian casualties. I refused, delayed the mission until we had better intelligence, saved lives, got investigated for insubordination. Eventually cleared, but the message was clear. Follow orders without question or find another career. So you chose to trust your own judgment over hierarchies that value obedience above doing what's right. Yes. Marcus met her eyes directly. I'd make the same choice again. Serafina understood what he was really saying, that principles mattered more than position, that sometimes doing right meant standing alone, that the cost of integrity was often isolation, but the cost of abandoning it was far higher. You're lonely too, she said softly. That's why you understood what Lyra needed that night. You recognized your own isolation in hers. Marcus didn't confirm or deny, but the answer was written in his expression, the guarded look of someone who'd learned not to expect connection. I stopped trying to make close friends after the fifth move, he said finally. Surface connections were easier, less painful when you had to leave. I got very good at being friendly without being close, present without being attached. He looked at Lyra, still held in her mother's arms, until I found a crying child by a fountain and remembered what it felt like to be lost and alone and convinced no one cared enough to look. I couldn't walk away from that. And now, Lyra asked, now that you know I'm a princess and there are protocols and expectations. Marcus smiled at her, something warm and real. Now I'm here because you asked me to stay, because you deserve to have at least one person in your life who cares about you without measuring the political implications, even if that person is just a former soldier who's good at noticing security gaps. You're more than that, Lyra said firmly. You're my friend. You taught me that being lost doesn't mean being alone. You're Uncle Kai. The nickname made Marcus blink in surprise. Uncle Kai. If Mother says cultural bonds make you family, then you're family. And family needs proper names. Lyra's logic was unassailable. So, Uncle Kai, Serafina felt something shift in her chest, watching her daughter claim this human as family, watching him accept it with quiet grace, understanding that somehow this connection was healing something broken in all three of them. "Very well," she said formally. "Marcus Blackwell, whom my daughter knows as Kai. You are acknowledged as family to this house, not by blood but by bond forged in genuine need. The title is yours if you'll accept it." Marcus looked overwhelmed, his professional composure cracking to reveal real emotion. "Your Majesty, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Lyra urged. "Say you'll stay. Say you'll keep teaching me about Earth and eagles and oceans that breathe. Say you'll be here." "Yes," Marcus said quietly. "Yes to all of it." And Serafina, watching her daughter's scales brighten with pure joy, thought that perhaps asking for help wasn't weakness after all. Perhaps accepting that you couldn't do everything alone was actually the beginning of real strength. Perhaps she'd been lost to these past 3 years. And perhaps, like her daughter, she was finally finding her way home. 2 weeks later, Lyra stood before the council during their regular session, not sitting beside her mother observing, not being presented as the royal heir, standing at a smaller podium that had been specially positioned for her height, addressing the assembled nobles and commanders with a prepared proposal. Serafina had been surprised when Lyra requested permission to speak. Surprised, and she admitted to herself, nervous. 7-year-old princesses didn't address the council. But then again, 7-year-old princesses didn't usually run across the chamber to embrace human contractors either. Lyra was rewriting the rules simply by being herself. "I want to talk about how royal children are educated," Lyra began, her young voice clear, despite obvious nervousness. "Right now I learn alone. I have tutors who teach me important things. But I don't learn with other children. I don't have friends my age. I don't know what normal kids care about or worry about." She paused, gathering courage. Serafina saw Marcus standing at his customary respectful distance, his expression encouraging. Catherine Walsh was taking notes, her face carefully neutral. "My friend Kai, Uncle Kai, told me about Earth," Lyra continued. "On Earth, even the children of presidents and prime ministers go to school with other children. They learn together, play together, make friends. And this makes them better leaders because they understand the people they govern." The logic was simple but powerful. Several nobles leaned forward interested, despite their initial skepticism. "I've never had a friend my own age," Lyra said, and Serafina heard the loneliness in her daughter's voice. "I don't know what it's like to play games with other kids, or share secrets, or argue about silly things. How can I possibly understand what children need if I've never lived like they do?" She looked directly at her mother. "I know there are reasons we do things the old way. Security, protocol, tradition. But maybe some reasons aren't good enough anymore. Maybe some traditions need to change." The chamber was silent, nobles exchanging glances. This was unprecedented. A 7-year-old challenging centuries of practice, and doing it with such clarity, such conviction. "I'm asking permission to attend the Southern District Children's Program 2 days each week," Lyra said firmly. "I want to learn with other children, make friends, understand lives different from mine. I think it will make me a better princess, and someday a better queen." She stood straight, her scales showing patterns of determination and barely controlled fear. She'd done it, said what she wanted to say. Now she had to wait for the response. Serafina rose from the throne and the court's attention shifted to her. She could shut this down, cite protocols and security concerns, explain why princesses required separate education. It would be easy, expected. Or she could do what Marcus had done for her daughter that night. Show up, be present, provide certainty that someone was listening without calculating the political implications first. "The princess raises valid points," Serafina said formally. "I propose we establish a pilot program. Princess Lyra will attend the Southern District Children's Educational Sessions 2 mornings per week for 3 months. We will assess the results and determine whether to continue." Lyra's scales blazed with triumph and gratitude. Around the chamber, nobles murmured approval or concern in equal measure. But the decision was made. As the session concluded and nobles filed out, Marcus caught Serafina's eye from across the chamber. He smiled slightly and nodded once. Approval, recognition, pride in what Lyra had accomplished. And Serafina realized that her daughter was right. This human who'd stumbled into their lives, who'd helped a lost child without expecting recognition, who'd stayed because a 7-year-old asked him to, he was family now. Not by blood, not by calculation, by choice, by presence, by showing up when it mattered and staying even when it was complicated. That evening, after Lyra had finally fallen asleep, still chattering excitedly about her upcoming school attendance, Serafina found Marcus in the Eastern Gardens. He was checking sensor arrays again, always working. "Thank you," she said simply. Marcus turned surprised by her presence. "Your Majesty, for what? For seeing my daughter when I'd stopped looking. For believing her when I didn't. For staying when you had every reason to leave." Serafina moved to stand beside the fountain where he'd found Lyra all those months ago. "You gave her back to me. I don't know if you understand what a gift that is." "She's remarkable," Marcus said quietly. "She always was. You just needed help remembering how to see it." "We both did." Serafina looked up at the cavern ceiling at the bioluminescent crystals mimicking stars far above. "I want to ask you something. Not as queen to subject, as one person to another." "All right. Would you teach me the way you teach her how to be present without second-guessing everything? How to see without calculating first? How to just exist with someone without measuring what it takes?" Her voice dropped. "I've forgotten how, if I ever knew." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled something warm and unguarded. "I'd be honored." Serafina. The use of her name without title felt strange and right at once. A step toward the kind of genuine connection she'd almost forgotten was possible. "Then I have one more request," she said. "Start calling me that, at least in private. I'm tired of being just a title, even to the people who matter most." "Serafina," he repeated, testing it. "All right, but then you call me Kai, since that seems to be my name now." Standing in the garden where loneliness had been transformed into connection, where a lost child had found someone willing to help her find her way, Queen Serafina felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. Real hope that perhaps she wasn't as alone as she'd believed, that perhaps asking for help wasn't weakness, that perhaps the bonds formed in genuine need were worth more than all the calculated political alliances in the empire, that perhaps, like her daughter, she was finally finding her way home. 2 months had passed since Lyra addressed the council. 2 months of attending the Southern District Children's Program, of making actual friends, her own age of learning that not every child had attendance and private tutors and ceremonial robes. 2 months of discovering that being different didn't have to mean being isolated. The formal recognition ceremony was scheduled for the first day of spring. Symbolic timing, Serafine had explained. New beginnings, transformation, growth marking the passage from one season to another. The Grand Council chamber had been prepared with more attention than usual. Banners representing the 6 territories hung from the vaulted ceiling, their colors vivid against the dark stone. The bioluminescent crystals had been polished until they gleamed, casting their shifting blue-violet light across assembled nobles, military commanders, and diplomatic representatives. 300 attendees this time, 50% more than had witnessed Lyra's unexpected embrace 2 months ago. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Princess Lyra sat beside her mother on the throne platform, wearing formal robes that had been specially tailored so they wouldn't trip her. Her scales were arranged in patterns meant to convey composed dignity, though excitement kept flickering through in brief flashes of color she couldn't quite control. Marcus stood below in the chamber proper, wearing formal attire that looked only marginally more comfortable than it had at previous ceremonies. He'd been briefed on the ceremony's structure. He would be called forward. Serafina would make formal statements about service to the royal family. Lyra would present a prepared speech thanking him. Marcus would accept with appropriate humility. The court would witness and acknowledge the bond. Simple, scripted, safe. But Lyra had other plans. The ceremony began with traditional formalities. Acknowledgement of the assembled witnesses. Invocation of the cultural traditions surrounding bonds formed in genuine need. Recitation of Marcus's security credentials and the improvements his work had brought to palace defenses over the past 8 months. All true, all utterly beside the point. Finally, Marcus was called forward. He approached the throne platform with military precision, executed a formal bow, and waited. Serafina rose her voice carrying through the chamber. Marcus Blackwell, known to my daughter as Kai, you have served this court with distinction. Your security assessments have strengthened our defenses and prevented potential breaches. For this, you have our gratitude. She paused, her scales shifting to warmer patterns. But you are not being recognized today for your technical skills, exceptional though they are. You are being recognized for something far more valuable, for seeing a lost child and helping her find her way home, for offering comfort without expectation, for caring without calculation. The Queen's gaze swept across the assembled court. In our culture, bonds formed in moments of genuine need are sacred. When my daughter publicly embraced you 2 months ago, she declared such a bond. Today we formalize that recognition. Today, you become family. She looked down at Lyra. My daughter will now speak. This was Lyra's cue to approach the railing and deliver Catherine's prepared remarks. Diplomatic, appropriate, meaningless. Lyra stood. She walked to the railing, and then she looked down at Marcus standing 40 feet below, and she thought about that night by the fountain. How scared she'd been. How his voice had cut through her panic. How he'd sat with her and told her stories and made her feel less alone. She thought about the past 2 months, learning with other children, making friends who liked her for herself, not because she was a princess. Understanding that different people had different lives, different challenges, different dreams. She thought about her mother learning to be present again after years of distance, learning to show up without armor, learning to ask for help. And she realized that reading Catherine's diplomatic speech would betray everything they'd learned, because this ceremony wasn't about diplomacy, it was about truth. Lyra set the prepared speech aside and heard her mother's sharp intake of breath behind her. Felt the sudden tension as Catherine and the other advisors realized she was going off script. 6 months ago, Lyra said, her young voice carrying through the profound silence that had fallen, I was lost in the Eastern Gardens. I was 7 years old and really scared. I couldn't find my attendants, and it was getting dark, and I thought I'd done something terrible and everyone would be angry. She gripped the railing with both hands, drawing courage from its solidity. A human came and sat beside me. He didn't know who I was, didn't ask my title. He just saw a scared kid and decided to help. Marcus's expression was guarded but attentive. He understood what she was doing, that she was about to say things that couldn't be unsaid. He told me his friends called him Kai. He told me about Earth, about eagles in mountains and oceans that sound like breathing and stars that look the same no matter where you are. He held my hand and walked with me until I felt safe again. Lyra's scales brightened with fierce conviction. For 6 months I talked about him, told everyone about my friend Kai, and everyone, tutors, doctors, advisors, told me he was imaginary, that my mind invented him because I was traumatized. She turned to look at her mother. You thought I'd broken, that something was wrong with me. You consulted specialists. You were worried, but you didn't believe me when I said he was real. Serafina's scales flickered with distress, but she didn't interrupt. Lyra turned back to address the court. Then 2 months ago I saw him here, in this chamber, and I ran to him because I'd been looking for him every single day, and he was real and I'd been right. Her voice rose with emotion she didn't try to control. The court fell silent. Everyone was shocked. Because princesses don't run. Princesses don't break protocol. Princesses don't embrace humans they barely know in front of everyone. She leaned forward over the railing, her attention fixed on the assembled nobles below. But I wasn't being a princess in that moment. I was being a kid who finally found her friend, and that's what everyone keeps missing. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably. Lyra didn't care. You all think this ceremony is about acknowledging Kai's service, about following tradition, about managing a situation that broke protocol. Her young face was set with determination. But you're wrong. This is about the fact that when I was lost and scared, one person cared enough to help. And he didn't ask what he'd get from it. Before anyone could interrupt, before protocol could reassert itself, Lyra pressed forward with the truth that needed saying. And that's what you don't understand. She continued, her voice now steady with conviction. He helped me because I needed help. That's all. But none of you can understand that without being suspicious. You think he must have known who I was, must have planned it, must have wanted something. She swept her gaze across the nobles. You can't imagine someone helping without expecting reward. So you assume Kai was calculating, manipulating, planning. A noble in the front rows, Lord Theron, one of the traditionalists, spoke up. Princess, with respect, your youth makes you naive about— No. Lyra's interruption was sharp and clear. My youth makes me see what you've forgotten. Kai just helped a lost kid. The fact that you can't believe that without suspicion says something about you, not about him. Lord Theron's scales flickered with indignation. Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. Perhaps the princess should— The princess should what? Lyra challenged before her mother could respond. Be quiet. Read the approved speech. Not say things that make you uncomfortable. The boldness of a 7-year-old challenging a senior noble directly sent shockwaves through the chamber. But Lyra pressed on. I'm 7 years old, and I understand something you've all forgotten. Real friendship is rare. Genuine care is precious. When someone treats you like a person instead of a position, you don't let protocols destroy it. She looked directly at Lord Theron. You've spent so long calculating everything that you forgot what it's like to just care about someone. That's sad. That's your problem, not mine. When the chamber erupted in whispers, some nobles looked scandalized. Others appeared thoughtful. A few younger members of the court were nodding slightly, recognizing truth in Lyra's words, even if they'd never dare voice it themselves. Lord Theron rose from his seat, his scales showing patterns of offense and anger. Your Majesty, I must protest. This child is speaking of matters she cannot possibly understand. Sit down, Theron. The command came not from Seraphina, but from Commander Vale, the senior military officer. The princess is asking questions we should have asked ourselves years ago. Let her speak. Lord Theron hesitated, caught between outrage and the military commander's authority. After a tense moment, he sat his scales still showing disapproval. Lyra felt her heart pounding, but continued. Uncle Kai taught me something that night by the fountain. He said being lost doesn't last forever if someone helps you find your way. But here's what I figure it out myself. Everyone in this room is lost. You've all been lost for so long you forgot what it feels like to be found. She looked at her mother, then back at the court. You're lost in your protocols, lost in your calculations, lost in all the rules about how things should be done. And you're so busy maintaining all that you can't see when something real happens right in front of you. Seraphina stood slowly, and Lyra tensed, uncertain whether her mother would support her or discipline her for the unprecedented breach. The queen moved to stand beside her daughter, one hand resting on Lyra's shoulder. When she spoke, her voice carried the absolute authority of someone who'd ruled for 2 decades, but also the warmth of a mother defending her child's truth. My daughter speaks with more courage than I've shown in years, Seraphina said. She identifies truths I've been too diplomatic to acknowledge. So let me be direct. Her scales shifted to patterns of fierce determination. For 3 years since my husband's death, I've been surrounded by calculation. Every conversation weighted with implications. Every relationship serving multiple agendas. Every interaction measured for advantage. She looked out at the assembled nobles, and several of them had the grace to look uncomfortable. You've all been very careful with me, very diplomatic, telling me what you think I want to hear rather than what I need to know, maneuvering for position rather than offering genuine support. Catherine Walsh stepped forward from the advisor's area, her expression troubled. Your Majesty, with respect— With respect, Seraphina interrupted gently. You wrote a speech for my daughter that said all the right diplomatic things and none of the true things. I don't blame you. That's the culture we've built here. Say what's proper, not what's real. She squeezed Lyra's shoulder gently. But my daughter has shown us a different way. She asked real questions, said uncomfortable truths, challenged assumptions we've held for generations. Not because she wanted to cause disruption, because she wanted to understand why we do things the way we do them. The Queen's voice grew stronger. And when the answer is because that's how it's always been done, she has the courage to say that's not good enough. That courage is what I want to honor today. Not just the bond with Marcus Blackwell, but the example of speaking truth even when it's uncomfortable. Lord Theron stood again more carefully this time. Your Majesty, while I appreciate the princess's candor, surely we must maintain some standards of protocol and propriety. If we allow, if we allow what Theron, Seraphina's tone was sharp. If we allow honesty, directness, children questioning why things are done certain ways, what exactly frightens you about that? The noble hesitated, clearly not expecting to be challenged so directly by the queen. I'll tell you what I think frightens you, Seraphina continued. The possibility that a 7-year-old might be right. That we've built a culture so focused on propriety and calculation that we've lost sight of what actually matters. That possibility threatens everything you've built your status on. She looked around the chamber. My daughter formed a bond with a human who helped her in a moment of genuine need. That bond is real. It's valuable. And the fact that it happened outside our traditional protocols doesn't make it invalid. It makes it remarkable. Seraphina's scales blazed with patterns of pride and determination. Today we recognize that bond. But more importantly, we acknowledge that sometimes our traditions need to be questioned. That this is how it's always been done isn't always sufficient justification. That genuine connection matters more than calculated advantage. She turned to Marcus, still standing at the base of the platform, witnessing this entire exchange with carefully controlled expression. Marcus Blackwell, Kai, you came to this palace as a contractor. You helped a lost child without recognition or reward. You stayed when she asked, even though it complicated your life. You've given both my daughter and myself something precious, the certainty that someone cares without keeping score. Her voice rang with formal authority. I name you royal companion to Princess Lyra, not a position of political power, simply recognition that you are family to this house, by choice, by bond forged in genuine need, by presence when presence mattered. Seraphina looked out at the court, her expression challenging anyone to object. And to those who still harbor suspicion about his motives, examine your own hearts first. Ask yourselves when you last helped someone without calculating the advantage, when you last offered care without measuring the return. If you can't answer honestly, perhaps you're not qualified to judge his character. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet of 2 months ago. This was uncomfortable, contemplative, the silence of people forced to examine assumptions they'd never questioned. Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying through the chamber's acoustics. Your Majesty, Princess Lyra, I don't know what to say that would be adequate. Say what you said that night in the gardens, Lyra called down to him, echoing her mother's words. Say what's true. Marcus looked up at her, and something in his guarded expression cracked, real emotion showing through his professional exterior. The truth is, he said slowly, when I found you crying by that fountain, I saw myself. Every time I'd been lost and scared and convinced no one was coming. Every time I'd felt alone, even surrounded by people. Every moment I'd wanted someone to just show up. His voice grew stronger. I helped you because I needed someone to do for you what no one did for me. Because helping you reminded me why I chose this work. Why protecting people matters more than following orders that are wrong. Marcus looked around the chamber, meeting eyes of nobles and commanders who'd been speculating about his motives for 2 months. I wasn't calculating political advantage. I was trying to save one scared child from the loneliness I'd felt for years. And somehow, his voice caught slightly. Somehow in helping her, she helped me too. He looked back at Lyra. You reminded me what real connection feels like. What it means to be seen as a person rather than a function. You gave me purpose beyond technical problem solving. You made me remember that sometimes the most important thing isn't following protocol, it's just showing up when someone needs you. Lyra felt tears prick at her eyes. She'd known Kai was her friend, but hearing him admit that he'd needed the friendship too, that the connection had saved him as much as it had saved her, that made everything more real, more precious. Before anyone could stop her, before protocol could reassert itself, Lyra did what felt right. She ran, down from the throne platform across the polished stone floor straight to Marcus. This time when she threw her arms around him, he didn't hesitate. He hugged her back, lifting her slightly off the ground, his embrace gentle but certain. Thank you for finding me, Lyra whispered against his shoulder. Thank you for looking for me, Marcus replied quietly. Thank you for believing I was real. The chamber didn't fall silent this time. Instead, a ripple of sound moved through the assembled witnesses. Not whispers of scandal or suspicion. Something softer, warmer. Recognition, perhaps. Maybe even approval. Because this was what the ceremony was supposed to be about. Not formality or tradition. Just acknowledgement that connection mattered. That care without calculation was worth protecting. That sometimes a lost child and a lonely adult could save each other simply by showing up. Serafina descended from the throne platform and approached them. When Lyra finally released Marcus and turned to her mother, she saw tears on Serafina's face. The queen didn't hide them, didn't try to maintain composure. You were right, Serafina said to her daughter. About all of it. About Kai being real. About me not listening. About this court needing to remember what real connection looks like. She looked at Marcus. I've spent 2 months watching you with my daughter. Watching her transform from a lonely child going through motions to a confident young person finding her voice. That's your gift. Not security expertise. The ability to see people clearly and help them see themselves better. You did that yourself, Serafina, Marcus replied gently, using her given name in public for the first time. The intimacy of it made several nobles' scales flicker with surprise. I just provided space for you both to remember what you'd temporarily forgotten. Then continued to provide that space. Serafina's expression was warm with gratitude. Stay, be family, keep reminding us that authenticity matters more than calculation. She looked out at the assembled court. I'm announcing formal policy changes. Royal children will no longer be educated in isolation. Princess Lyra's participation in the Southern District program has proven valuable. This will become standard practice for all royal family members. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the nobles. This was more than symbolic recognition. This was substantive change to centuries-old tradition. Additionally, Serafina continued, I'm establishing new protocols for court interaction. Less rigid formality, more directness. I want advisors who tell me uncomfortable truths rather than comfortable lies. I want relationships built on genuine respect rather than political maneuvering. Her scales blazed with determination. My daughter taught me that strength isn't about maintaining perfect control. It's about showing up honestly, being vulnerable when necessary, admitting when you need help. These are the qualities I want to model. These are the values we'll prioritize going forward. She placed one hand on Lyra's shoulder and extended the other to Marcus. This family, unconventional as it is, represents what I want this court to become. Real, connected, willing to break protocol when protocol prevents genuine relationship. Lord Theron stood one final time. Your Majesty, I apologize. To you, to the princess, to Marcus Blackwell. The child was right. We have been so focused on maintaining tradition that we forgot to question whether all traditions serve us well. His scales shifted to patterns of genuine contrition. Perhaps it's time we learn to listen more and judge less, to question our assumptions, to value authenticity over calculation. He bowed formally to Lyra. Thank you, Princess, for having the courage to speak truths we needed to hear. Other nobles began rising, adding their acknowledgement. Not all of them, some still looked skeptical or uncomfortable. But enough. Enough to signal that something had shifted, that change was possible. The formal portion of the ceremony concluded with traditional acknowledgments, but the atmosphere had transformed. Nobles approached Marcus without suspicion, offering genuine congratulations. Military commanders engaged him in serious discussion, treating him as valued colleague rather than outsider contractor. And Lyra moved through it all with new confidence, her hand occasionally finding Marcus's or her mother's, anchoring herself to the people who had helped her find her way. Late that evening, long after the crowds had dispersed and the formal robes had been exchanged for comfortable clothing, the three of them walked through the eastern gardens. The fountain burbled quietly in the gathering darkness, bioluminescent flowers beginning to glow as the cavern's light crystals dimmed to simulate nightfall. This is where it started, Lyra said, sitting on the fountain's edge. Right here. Marcus sat beside her, and after a moment's hesitation, Serafina joined them. The queen of the Thravian Empire sitting on a garden fountain like she was just another person seeking quiet space. I thought I'd lost you that night, Serafina said quietly to her daughter. For 3 hours, I didn't know where you were. If you were hurt, if someone had taken you, it was the worst 3 hours of my life since your father died. I'm sorry I got lost, Lyra replied softly. You were 7. You wandered away while playing. That's what children do. Serafina looked at Marcus. Thank you for finding her, for staying with her, for making sure she wasn't alone in her fear. Thank you for letting me stay, Marcus replied, for accepting me into your family even though it was complicated, even though it challenged traditions. Those complications were worth it. Serafina's scales shifted to warm patterns. You gave me my daughter back. The real her, not the carefully controlled princess persona she'd learned to perform. That's worth more than any political advantage. Lyra leaned against her mother's side, comfortable in a way she hadn't been in years. Can I ask you something, both of you? Anything, they replied in unison, then smiled at the synchronization. Why do you think it was so hard for everyone to believe that Kai just helped me without wanting anything? The adults were quiet, considering the question seriously. Because it's rare, Marcus said finally. Most people want something even when help seems free. Recognition, reciprocity, advantage. So when someone helps without expectation, it doesn't compute. Seems suspicious. But you helped without wanting anything, Lyra pointed out. I wanted something, Marcus corrected gently. I wanted to remember what it felt like to do the right thing just because it was right. Not because orders demanded it. Not because it would benefit my career. Just because a child needed help and I could provide it. He looked at the fountain, remembering. After I left the military, I felt lost. Like I'd lost my purpose along with my rank. Security work paid well, but it was just work. Nothing that mattered beyond protecting property. His voice grew softer. And then I found you crying, and helping you mattered, not strategically, just in the immediate human sense of making one person's terrible night slightly less terrible. That reminded me why I became a soldier in the first place. To protect people, to make them feel safer. So I helped you too, Lyra said, understanding blooming. You helped me too, Marcus confirmed. Serafina looked between them. You both needed each other that night. You both saved each other from loneliness, from the feeling that genuine connection was impossible. She took a breath. I've been thinking about what you said in the ceremony, Lyra, about everyone being lost. You're right. I've been lost since your father died. Lost in grief and duty and the crushing responsibility of ruling alone. You're not alone anymore, Lyra said firmly. You have me, and you have Uncle Kai. We're family now. Real family. Real family, Marcus repeated, something warm in his voice. I like that. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, listening to the fountain's gentle music. The gardens that had witnessed fear and loneliness now witnessed healing. Connection. The transformation of isolation into belonging. Finally, Lyra spoke again, her voice thoughtful. I want to do more. What I did today at the ceremony, speaking truth, even when it was uncomfortable, I want to keep doing that. I want to help change things. You're 7, Serafina said gently but not dismissively. I know, but that doesn't mean I can't see what needs changing. Doesn't mean I can't ask questions. Lyra's conviction was fierce. Uncle Kai questioned orders even though he was just a soldier. I can question traditions even though I'm just a princess. You're not just anything, Marcus said. You're Princess Lyra Thravis, future queen, person of extraordinary courage and clarity. Those qualities aren't diminished by youth. They're amplified by it. Serafina looked at her daughter with wonder and something like pride. When did you become so brave? When I had people who believed me, Lyra replied simply, when I wasn't alone anymore. Marcus stood stretching. It's late. We should probably head inside before the guards start worrying. But Serafina stopped him with a gesture. One more moment. There's something I need to say to both of you. She stood facing them both. 6 months ago, my daughter was lost in these gardens. 4 months ago, I thought she'd broken. 2 months ago, she ran across a formal chamber to embrace someone the court had never heard of. And today, she spoke truth to power in a way I've never had the courage to do. Her scales shifted through patterns of gratitude and love. Both of you have given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope, connection, the certainty that I don't have to do everything alone. that asking for help isn't weakness, that genuine relationship is worth more than political calculation. She looked at Lyra. You taught me to listen, to question, to value authenticity over protocol. Then at Marcus. You taught me that showing up matters more than maintaining facades, that presence without agenda is the rarest and most valuable gift. Her voice grew thick with emotion. Thank you, both of you, for finding each other, for finding me, for helping all of us find our way home. Lyra moved to embrace her mother, and after a moment Marcus joined them. The three of them stood together in the gardens under the soft glow of bioluminescent flowers, holding onto each other like anchors in uncertain seas. A family, not by blood, not by tradition, by choice, by need, by the simple revolutionary act of showing up when it mattered. And in that moment, Queen Seraphina understood something profound. That the deepest bonds weren't forged through bloodlines or political alliances. They were built through presence, through vulnerability, through the courage to say, I need help, and the grace to answer, I'm here. That sometimes a human telling stories about breathing oceans could change everything. That love, real, uncomplicated love, was worth breaking every protocol to protect. 4 years had passed since that ceremony. 4 years of gradual transformation as Lyra's example rippled through court culture. 4 years of questioning, growing learning to value authenticity over calculation. The Grand Council chamber looked the same but felt different. The same vaulted ceiling, the same bioluminescent crystals, the same assembled nobles and commanders. But the atmosphere had transformed from political theater to something more genuine, more direct, more real. Princess Lyra Thravis, now 11 years old and weeks from her 12th birthday, stood at the central podium, addressing the quarterly assembly, not sitting beside her mother observing, not reading prepared remarks, speaking with confidence earned through years of growing into herself. She'd shot up in height over the past year, now nearly 5 feet tall. Her scales showed the more complex patterns of approaching adolescence, shimmering with colors that shifted as she spoke. But her essential nature remained unchanged. Curious, brave, determined to understand why things work the way they did. The cross-species educational initiative has exceeded all projections. She reported, her voice clear and strong. No longer a child's high pitch, but not yet an adult's depth either. Something in between. Growing. Children from human settlements and Thravian territories are learning together, building friendships, developing understanding that will serve both peoples for generations. She displayed data on projection screens, integration metrics, academic performance, social development indicators. All positive, all demonstrating the value of the changes she championed 4 years ago. 247 Thravian children now attend integrated programs, Lyra continued. 93 human children participate in palace educational exchanges. The results speak for themselves. Better critical thinking skills, improved cultural understanding, decreased prejudice on both sides. She paused, letting the data settle, then pressed forward. I propose we expand the program significantly. Currently, it serves primary education levels. I want to extend it through advanced study, create pathways for humans and Thravians to pursue collaborative research, establish joint academies where both species learn together from childhood through professional training. The assembled court listened attentively. No whispers of scandal. No calculations about whether supporting a child's proposal would enhance or diminish status. Just genuine engagement with ideas that mattered. Lyra had done that. 4 years of questioning. 4 years of suggesting. 4 years of demonstrating that direct truth served better than diplomatic evasion. She'd changed the culture simply by refusing to accept it as unchangeable. When she finished her presentation and opened the floor for questions, the exchanges were substantive, real dialogue, not performance for political advantage, but actual discussion of implementation challenges, resource allocation, timeline, feasibility. Commander Vale stood. Princess, have you considered the security implications of expanded integration? More human presence in palace facilities requires additional protocols. Yes, Commander. I've worked with Uncle Kai on a comprehensive security framework. Lyra pulled up additional data. The recommendations address access control, background verification, and emergency protocols, without creating barriers that undermine the program's goals. She smiled slightly. Uncle Kai says good security is invisible. It protects without making people feel restricted. That's what we've designed. Several nobles nodded appreciation for the thoughtful approach. The fact that a now 15-year-old proposal from Lyra could receive serious consideration without condescension or dismissal spoke to how much had shifted. Lady Theron, Lord Theron's daughter, who joined the council 2 years ago, raised her hand. Princess, what feedback have you received from the children themselves? Not the metrics, but their actual experience. Lyra's scales brightened. This was the question she'd hoped someone would ask. I asked them, directly, spent 3 weeks interviewing participants. She switched to a different screen showing quotes and observations. They say things like, I didn't know Thravians like the same games we do. And my human friend taught me a card game from Earth. And I want to visit the surface settlements when I'm older. Her voice grew warmer. But my favorite response came from a 7-year-old Thravian girl. She said, before the program, I thought humans were just the people who lived above us. Now Mara is my best friend. I don't think about her being human. She's just Mara. The chamber was quiet, nobles, considering the profound simplicity of that statement. That's what we're building, Lyra said softly. A future where species is just a characteristic, not a barrier. Where children grow up seeing each other as individuals, not categories. Where friendship crosses boundaries we've maintained for generations. She looked directly at the assembled court. You asked me 4 years ago why I wanted to attend school with other children. This is why. Because isolation breeds ignorance. Because walls create fear. Because the only way to truly understand someone is to share experiences with them. Queen Seraphina, watching from the throne with undisguised pride, spoke up. The council will review Princess Lyra's expansion proposal. But I want to note that in 4 years, she has proven every skeptic wrong. Integration was supposed to compromise security. It hasn't. It was supposed to distract from royal duties. It didn't. It was supposed to be a naive child's fantasy. It wasn't. The queen stood her scales, showing patterns of fierce pride. My daughter saw what needed changing and made it happen, not through political maneuvering, but through clear vision and persistent effort. She's 11 years old, and she's already a better leader than many who have held power for decades. Seraphina's gaze swept across the nobles. When we vote on this expansion, remember that. Remember that 4 years ago, a 7-year-old had the courage to question centuries of tradition. And she was right. The session concluded with formal acknowledgments, but the mood was celebratory. Nobles approached Lyra with genuine congratulations and substantive questions about implementation. This wasn't performance. They actually wanted to understand her vision and help make it work. As the chamber emptied, Marcus Uncle Kai, to Lyra trusted advisor to Seraphina, recognized family to their house, approached from his customary position. He'd been standing at respectful distance throughout the presentation, watching with quiet satisfaction. He'd aged well over 4 years. A few more lines around his eyes maybe, touch of gray at his temples, but the same steady presence that had anchored a lost child and helped an isolated queen remember how to connect. Proud of you, kid, he said simply as Lyra gathered her materials. You helped write half those security protocols, Lyra replied with a grin. I should be thanking you. You asked the right questions. I just provided technical answers. Marcus smiled. But seriously, what you've built here, it matters. Real change. The kind that lasts because it's built on genuine improvement, not political expediency. Lyra looked around the now mostly empty chamber. Do you remember that night 4 years ago when you found me crying by the fountain? Every detail, Marcus said quietly. I was so scared. I thought I'd never find my way back. Thought everyone would be angry. Lyra's voice grew soft. And then you showed up. Told me about eagles and oceans and stars. Made me feel less alone. She looked up at him. I think that's when this really started. Not the educational program. The whole thing. Learning that being lost doesn't last if someone helps. That asking for help isn't weakness. That genuine connection matters more than protocol. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You taught me something that night, too. Reminded me that the most important work isn't following orders or implementing systems. It's showing up when someone needs you. Everything else is just details. Serafina joined them, having finished her formal dismissals. Are you three going to stand here reminiscing, or shall we walk the gardens? It's unseasonably warm for late winter. Gardens, Lyra said immediately. It had become their ritual over 4 years. After important events, after difficult days, after triumphs and challenges, they walked the gardens together. The three of them. Their small, unconventional family. The eastern gardens had changed in 4 years. New pathways had been added. Additional bioluminescent flowers planted. The fountain had been repaired and upgraded, its water flowing more beautifully than before. But it was still recognizably the same place where everything had begun. They sat on the fountain's edge, as had become their custom. Lyra in the middle, flanked by her mother and Uncle Kai. Three people who'd all been lost in different ways, who'd found each other through circumstance and choice. Tell me honestly, Serafina said, how do you feel about the expansion proposal? Not the political viability. How you actually feel. Lyra considered this carefully. One of the things Uncle Kai had taught her was to distinguish between what she thought she should feel and what she actually felt, to trust her own emotional responses. Excited, she said finally, a little scared, worried I'm moving too fast, but also worried I'm not moving fast enough. Proud of what we've accomplished, eager to do more. She looked at her mother. Is that how you feel when you're making big decisions, like you're pulling in 10 directions at once? Serafina laughed, something she did much more easily now than 4 years ago. Always, every major decision feels like that. The difference is experience teaches you to trust your judgment despite the uncertainty. And to ask for help, Marcus added. Don't forget that part. And to ask for help, Serafina agreed, which I'm much better at now than I was 4 years ago. Thanks to both of you. Lyra drew patterns in the water with her fingertips. Do you think Father would be proud of what we've done? The question hung in the air. Serafina's husband, Lyra's father, had died 7 years ago. Lyra's memories of him were fragmentary at best, but she'd been thinking about him more lately, wondering what kind of king he'd been. What kind of father? Yes, Serafina said without hesitation, he would be immensely proud of your courage, of your vision, of your unwillingness to accept because that's how it's always been done, as sufficient answer. She was quiet for a moment. He was a questioner too, always pushing boundaries, challenging assumptions. I love that about him. But after he died, I retreated, stopped questioning, accepted everything as fixed and unchangeable because it felt safer than pushing for change. And now, Lyra asked, now I remember what he taught me. That questioning is how we grow. That change is necessary for survival. That the most dangerous thing a civilization can do is ossify into unchangeable tradition. Serafina looked at her daughter. You reminded me of that, made me brave again. Marcus had been quiet, but now he spoke. My father used to say that the measure of a good life isn't whether you avoid getting lost. Everyone gets lost sometimes. The measure is whether you help others find their way when you can. He looked at Lyra. You were lost that night, but you didn't stay lost. And instead of just moving on, you decided to make sure other people, other children wouldn't have to feel that alone. That's leadership. Real leadership. Lyra felt warmth spread through her chest. Pride, but also something deeper, purpose, connection. The certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. I've been thinking about something, she said slowly. About what happens next, after the educational expansion, after the integration programs. What's the next step? What do you think it should be? Serafina asked, always encouraging her daughter to articulate her own vision before offering guidance. Cultural exchange programs. Lyra said, the idea crystallizing as she spoke. Not just children learning together. Adults too. Humans and Thravians working together on projects. Science, art, engineering, medicine. Breaking down walls at every level, not just education. She looked between her mother and Uncle Kai. We've proven children can bridge species differences. Now we need to prove adults can too. That the barriers we've maintained are artificial. That collaboration makes both peoples stronger. Marcus smiled. Ambitious. I like it. Ambitious doesn't begin to cover it, Serafina said, but her scales showed patterns of approval. That's a multi-decade undertaking, requires restructuring, trade agreements, security protocols, diplomatic frameworks. You're talking about fundamentally reimagining the relationship between our peoples. Yes, Lyra said simply. That's exactly what I'm talking about. The queen looked at her daughter, 11 years old, almost 12, already thinking like a leader who'd change the world, and felt something shift in her chest. Not fear of her daughter's ambition, pride in it. Then we'll start planning, Serafina said. Together. The three of us and whoever else we need to bring in. We'll figure out how to make it work. The three of us, Lyra repeated, liking the sound of it. Our family. Our very weird family, Marcus added with a smile. A Thravian queen, a Thravian princess, and a human former soldier who stumbled into their lives by accident. Not by accident, Lyra corrected. By choice. You chose to help me that night. We chose to let you stay. We keep choosing each other every day. She looked at both of them. That's what family means, right? Choosing to show up, choosing to care, choosing to help each other find the way when someone gets lost. That's exactly what it means, Serafina said softly. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. The fountain burbled beside them in eternal and unchanged. But the three people sitting around it had transformed completely. A lonely child had found her voice and purpose. An isolated queen had rediscovered a connection and courage. A drifting soldier had found family and meaning. All because one night, 6 years ago, a human heard someone crying and decided to help. No calculation, no agenda, just presence when presence mattered. And in a world built on political maneuvering and careful calculation, that simple act of genuine care had been the most revolutionary thing possible. Not because it was grand or strategic, but because it was real. Because it reminded everyone who witnessed it of something fundamental they'd forgotten. That we're all lost sometimes, that asking for help isn't weakness, that showing up for each other without agenda, without calculation, without expectation of reward is what transforms isolation into belonging. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit beside someone who's crying and say, "You're not alone. Let me help you find your way." Lyra stood stretching. "Come on, it's getting cold. Let's go inside." But Serafina caught her hand. "One more moment. There's something I want to say." She looked at both of them, her daughter and the man who'd become family through circumstance and choice. 4 years ago, when Lyra ran across that chamber to embrace you, Marcus, the entire court fell silent, shocked, scandalized, uncertain what it meant. Her scales shifted to patterns of gratitude and love. Today, when she presented her vision for expanded integration, they listened, engaged, contributed. They didn't fall silent because they were shocked. They fell silent because they were actually hearing what she had to say. Serafina squeezed Lyra's hand gently. "That's the transformation you created. Not just in policy or programs, in culture, in how we see each other, in what we value." She looked at Marcus. "And you. You've been the quiet constant through all of it, teaching Lyra, supporting me, showing up without fanfare or expectation of recognition. You've given this family more than protection or security expertise. You've given us the example of what it means to show up authentically, consistently, with genuine care." Her voice grew thick with emotion. "I don't say this often enough. Thank you, both of you, for being exactly who you are, for helping me become who I needed to be, for building something real together." Lyra hugged her mother tightly, and Marcus joined them after a moment's hesitation. The three of them stood together in the gardens, holding on to each other like they had so many times before. A family, unconventional, complicated, perfect in its imperfections. And as they finally headed inside, Lyra looked back at the fountain one last time, the place where everything had changed, where a lost child had found someone willing to help her find her way. She smiled. Being lost didn't last forever, not when you had people who cared enough to help you navigate home. And now she would spend her life doing the same for others, showing up when people needed help, asking questions when answers didn't make sense, building bridges where others saw only walls. Because that's what Uncle Kai had taught her. Because that's what family did. Because sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply caring about someone without calculating the cost. The fountain burbled behind them, eternal and patient, waiting for the next lost soul who might need to hear that they weren't alone. That help was coming, that being lost was only temporary, as long as someone cared enough to help you find your way.